the weight of dust and destiny. The sun was merciless that day, hanging low in a copper-colored sky, baking the land until it shimmered like a fever dream. The woman's hands were blistered. Her dress clung to her back with sweat, and her boots sank into the dry earth as she leaned into the stubborn weight of her wagon. Every inch forward felt like a mile, every step a test of willpower. The wagon creaked with protest, piled high with the remnants of her life. An old trunk, a few quilts, jars of preserves, and a small rocking chair that had once belonged to her mother. Each item was more than wood or fabric. It was memory, history, and survival. But out here on the open trail, memory weighed heavy, and survival demanded sacrifice. The wheel had lodged itself into a rut, a cruel trap carved into the earth by countless wagons before hers. And no matter how she strained, the wagon would not budge. Dust stung her eyes, mingling with the sting of frustrated tears. She thought of the people who had told her she wouldn't make it alone, that the wilderness would chew her up and spit her out. She thought of her late husband, whose dream of the frontier had carried them west, until fever carried him into the grave. Now she was alone, clinging to that dream with every ounce of strength left in her tired frame. And just when her knees buckled and despair curled its cold fingers around her heart, she saw him. A shadow first, etched against the horizon like a ghost wandering through the haze. The figure grew closer, the silhouette sharpening into the unmistakable shape of a cowboy, his hat dipped low, his coat trailing the wind, and his steps deliberate, slow, steady, like a man who belonged to the silence of the land. She froze, her breath catching in her chest, fear and hope warring inside her. Strangers were dangerous out here. Strangers could be salvation or ruin. He didn't speak when he reached her, didn't greet her with words or ask for introductions. He just looked at the wagon, then at her, then down at his calloused hands. Without ceremony, he set his shoulder against the wood and pushed. The wagon groaned, the rut gave way, and the wheels rolled free. Her eyes widened as the impossible happened in seconds. The burden that had chained her finally released. She gasped, clutching the side of the wagon, but he didn't stop there. He kept pushing until the wagon was back on steady ground. Dust swirled around them, the silence heavy but not empty. It was full of meaning, full of a strange quiet power. She wanted to thank him, but the words tangled in her throat. Who was this man? Why had he stopped for her? And why did she feel as though fate had just shifted its course? She didn't know then, but this silent cowboy was about to change everything she thought. She knew about survival, about strength, and about hope rising even in the loneliest of deserts. The silent strength of a stranger. The woman stood frozen, her hands gripping the wagon as if it might drift away now that it had been freed. The cowboy straightened, dusted off his gloves and adjusted his hat, his eyes never leaving the endless road ahead. He still hadn't spoken, not a single word, yet his presence was louder than thunder in the emptiness of the plain. She finally found her voice, a fragile whisper of gratitude, but he only nodded in reply, the faintest curve of acknowledgement passing his lips. Then, without asking, he took hold of the wagon handle and began to guide it forward, as though it had always been his duty, as though her burden had become his own. She hurried to catch up, confusion and relief swirling inside her chest. Hours passed in this strange companionship, the crunch of boots and the squeak of wagon wheels the only sounds between them. The woman found herself studying him, his silent discipline, the way he scanned the horizon with cautious eyes, the way his hands moved with precision and care. He was not just a man passing by. He was someone who carried storms within him, someone who had seen too much and chosen silence over words. And yet in that silence, she felt safe in a way she hadn't since before her husband died. When dusk painted the sky in shades of fire and violet, the cowboy finally stopped and gestured toward a cluster of rocks where they could rest. He built a small fire with the ease of habit, set a tin pot on the flames, and handed her a cup of bitter coffee. Still no words, only actions. Yet in those actions, she felt a story being told, one of loss, resilience, and an unspoken promise that she wasn't as alone as she thought. She realized then that strength didn't always roar. Sometimes it moved quietly, carrying wagons out of ruts and hearts out of despair. That night, as the stars shimmered overhead and the prairie winds hummed their lonely song, she dared to believe again. Maybe the world hadn't abandoned her. Maybe the road ahead wasn't meant to be walked alone. And maybe this silent cowboy, this stranger who spoke through deeds instead of words, had been placed in her path for a reason greater than she yet understood. Tomorrow the journey would continue, and the land would test them both. But for the first time in a long time, she felt that the weight on her shoulders was lighter, not because it had vanished, but because someone else had chosen to carry it with her. She looked at him across the fire, his face calm, his gaze lost in the flames, and she knew deep in her soul everything had changed.